Hey y'all, GhoulFren here. I saw a very interesting video earlier today. This video um, broke through my feeds, so to speak, and it is about a topic that essentially should be important to everyone. And I'm sorry if I can't sit still in one place. I'm sort of just pacing around here. Just sometimes this is how I get, the thought processes, the synapses in my mind to just start firing off. Sometimes pacing helps with that, you know. Anyway, what I really wanted to just talk about is basically the hardships that most people are facing these days. A lot of normal everyday people, myself included. I am by no metrics a YouTube celebrity of any sort, and I don't claim to be. But this problem that we've all have been facing with raising prices and everything like that, this has all been going on since the 1970s. So like 50-ish, 60 years. All of these problems have been going on, and generally people like to blame generations before them for any issues that they're facing right now, and I feel like that in itself is a bit disingenuous. I don't feel like every person born in the boomer generation is solely responsible for all of the hardships we're facing. That's just me. If you are adept at history at all, you'd realize the same thing pretty much happened 100 years ago, right at the turn of the century, after robber barons just made the country generally worse for the average working American, and that's where we get these colorful, you know, insults and whatnot that people have been using for such a long time. Like the term carpetbagger, alright, started cropping up over 100 years ago. But the main case use for the word carpetbagger was around the start of the 20th century when things were generally going rough for the everyday American. Some people, they like to forget. They like to forget that the Great Depression happened, and the Great Depression was one of those things that didn't just affect Americans, but the entire world. All right? The Great Depression didn't just affect us back here at home, it affected everybody. And lately I've been seeing a lot of parallels to that, to the leadership that we've been getting into this country compared to the leadership that was getting into this country 100 years ago when all of this stuff was taking place and happening, and just generally, made it bad for everybody. And it didn't help that a lot of the corporations back in those days were lobbying in the very same way that corporations today are lobbying in Congress to get some restrictions taken down, like the ones that were taken down when Bill Clinton effectively became president. Now, I'm not saying Bill Clinton is completely to blame for a lot of the stuff that's going on right now. There has been decades, a century worth of wild incidents and things that have transpired to where we are at in this day and age. And all I gotta say, it's not completely the boomers' fault. That's all I gotta say when it comes to that. It's not completely their faults. Yes, they were born into a generation that had it easy, that could easily get jobs, could easily afford a home, afford a car, everything like that. But it's not just the boomers. It's not. Because there's people within Gen X, people within the millennial Gen Y generation, my generation, that are, at the top of the company ladders, causing trouble for everybody else. And, and I will agree with what Gen Z says, Like, it's not entirely the faults of the boomers that we as a society, we in the younger generations have it bad here in the United States. Now, I'm not saying that all of these economic hardships are happening all across the world. They could be happening in other places in the world, but they're probably, don't take my word for it, but they're probably not related. Or what, they might very well be related because, again, all the stuff that we're seeing happening with corporations taking advantage of people, It's giving a whole, like, hey, this happened, 100 years ago. This happened at the turn of the century. Now, if it was 100 years ago, everybody would have known who to blame. Because it wasn't just a generational thing. All right, it's class based. With the different class structures and everything was class based back in those days, but everything is still class based today. In fact, there's been a widening divide between the poorer classes and the upper classes, with an ever eroding middle class that has been steadily tapering off since the financial crisis and housing bubble of 2008. Ever since then, there has just been this ever widening divide between different classes in the structure. If I can give an example of this, my father, he used to be middle class. I was in the middle class when I was growing up and living with my father. We were never upper middle class. We were always just like middle or lower middle, which with those kinds of things, it is what it is. But I was a teenager back in the late aughts to early 2010s. I became an adult at around 2013 was when I turned 18. I was 17 back in 2012, 16 back in 2011. But year after year, when I was growing up, it always seemed like my father was in a legal battle that I knew nothing about. Or he was incurring a debt that I knew nothing about, which, I mean, yeah, I would know nothing about it because I'm not my father. And lately, it's been getting hard for him to sort of just pull himself up by his bootstraps. And he's not the only American that, was in the middle class, got pushed into the lower class, had to, swallow his pride and do all of that. My dad was still able to pull himself out. He was still able to pull himself out of his economic hardships. And, you know, a lot of Americans are capable of pulling themselves out of it. Not everybody, but I don't want to say a good majority because it's not the majority of Americans that can pull themselves out of situations that would otherwise leave poorer people homeless. But generally, I don't think that it is the boomers' fault. Granted, the boomers enjoyed the benefits that the silent generation brought to them, which my grandfather, he was part of the silent generation. The only boomer grandparents that I have are on my father's side, and even those grandparents, one died struggling. And the other one, I don't want to say they're struggling, but it has come to a point where people now have to live in multi-generational households like they did back 100 years ago and beyond. Because of how bad everything has gotten, from laws being changed, from restrictions being repealed, and things of that nature. And I will say this, while Bill Clinton is not to blame for everything that's going on, he is to blame for a lot of the economic downturn and a lot of the struggles that people are facing with repealing restrictions, that essentially disallows corporations and companies from forming monopolies, which is, something that has been happening a lot lately. There has been something in recent news to this effect with Netflix obtaining Warner Brothers, but not their cable assets. They tried to obtain the cable assets, but Paramount has been doing their own hostile takeovers. So now all of these big corporations are cannibalizing themselves just so the sources where you get all of your entertainment come from only a handful of sources. And that was something we put laws in place 100 years ago to try and prevent. And things like Warner Discovery. Warner Discovery never should have happened. Netflix should have never been able to buy Warner Brothers. Never. And have you heard of the plans that they're making in terms of Warner Brothers films and theaters? Yeah. Movie theaters are going to be seeing a lot less Warner Brothers films, and Warner Brothers films are gonna be, in theaters for at the minimum of 45 days, is what I read online. But this is just like an example of corporations just eating each other so that they can, gain the majority of intellectual property to then deal out to the masses in a package that would, entail these customers pay monthly fees to obtain this entertainment and this information, and this is something that has been warned about for decades, not just like, Netflix, because Netflix came out around like, what was it, 1996, 1998 or something. Yeah, Netflix is that old. They used to just deliver DVDs to people's doors. That's how old Netflix is. Before they were even a streaming service. When I was a kid, I would beg my parents if there was not a movie in Redbox that I wanted to watch, just get that movie off of Netflix, and then bing, bang, boom. Wait the next day. It typically takes a couple days, and then bing, bang, boom, you get the movie in the mailbox. I don't know anybody that has ever returned their DVDs. I've returned my DVDs, but I don't know anybody who has when it came to that sort of business model. But like, I'm getting sidetracked here. The whole point is, it's not a generational thing that's going on. Granted, the boomer generation has enjoyed more benefits from the things that the silent generation fought for. It's ultimately the robber barons and the corporations that are actively trying to hostily take each other over in order to make it to where they're the ultimate moneymaker. And that, I feel, is putting this country in a downward spiral, among other things like outsourcing jobs to China and third world countries for cheap labor and things of that nature. Which outsourcing our jobs solved nothing for us in the long run. It really didn't. What it did was make a regime hell-bent on destroying us all more powerful, and that's another issue, that gets, nicely wrapped up around this whole economic debacle that we're currently facing in this country. But that is going to do it for me for today's video. If you liked what you saw and you enjoy this sort of content, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, hit that bell notification, and if you think I'm ugly and smell gross, hit that dislike. Anyways, this is GhoulFren with another episode of GhoulFren Speaks. I will see you guys next time.